So, there's an unspoken rule up in the mountains that no matter who you are, friend, bitter rival, stranger, anyone, if you are ever in a pinch and come across another hunter's cabin, you're welcome to seek shelter there. Maybe it's unspoken because it's common courtesy and that whole do unto others thing, or maybe it's unspoken because there's hardly anyone to speak to in the winter months. Especially, you'd be hard pressed to see another soul for weeks or months. But that's the rule. You need it, you use it. No judgment, no questions asked. Just don't steal anything. Now, I'm not a burly, seasoned mountain man that flosses with tree bark and never shaves, but I do like to hunt. I often leave my small Alaskan village for weeks at a time and take to my hunting lodge up in the mountains. I'm a fairly cautious guy, and I know the mountains can be treacherous, so when I leave prepared. I check the long-term forecast, gather the necessary supplies, bring backups, and make sure I've got enough of everything I need to survive at least a week longer than I plan on staying, just in case. I always believed my precautions would protect me, but like a child's security blanket, they are only a paper-thin illusion of safety. There's literally no planning what Mother Nature decides she's in a mood. That's why I never expected to get caught in a horrible blizzard on that horrendous day. It had started out sunny and cold, but as the day progressed, a few clouds had formed. By the time they amazed into a heavy cloud covering, I was already on my way back to my cabin, with a couple hairs hanging over my shoulders. I had named them dinner and breakfast, as I was planning on eating breakfast for dinner and dinner for breakfast, if only to make myself laugh, as it's the little things like that that keeps the solitude from turning into loneliness. The snowfall seemed to come out of nowhere, like someone had knocked an awning shut, and all of the snow collected on top had fallen all at once. Except it wasn't a single tidal wave of snow. No, it was a relentless, unending assault. Last I checked, the weather reports hadn't mentioned a blizzard, and yet a blizzard was what I found myself walking through. It got very, very dark, very, very fast, and I kicked myself for leaving my flashlight back at my lodge. I mean, I'd planned on coming home long before nightfall, so I hadn't thought I needed it. But unfortunately, I'd been sorely mistaken. The snow prickled painfully as it darted into my eyes. I'd been squinting almost all the way to keep those sub-zero jerks from stabbing me blind. The wind howled as gales cut through my clothes, literally right down to my bones. I could barely see 2 feet in front of me, and couldn't see the 2 feet beneath me as they sank in an ever-growing blanket of white. I'm not sure when I realized I was even lost. At some point, I knew I should have arrived at my cabin, but all I saw was white, with a few slivers of gray swaying in the thick breeze. The hairs at the back of my neck became stiff and battering up against me with every puff of air and every awkward crashing footfall. I was running out of energy, running out of ideas, and beginning to panic. I could have spun around in a computer chair 100 times and felt less disoriented than I did in that whiteout. And then I walked right into a cabin. I mean, literally. It had become so dark, and the snow had become so heavy that I couldn't even see the structure until I stumbled face first right into it. I had to hold my hands up against the wooden facade so that I wouldn't lose it in the snow. As I held on, I circled around and around until I finally could feel a door. I wasn't just in a pinch. This was life or death. In the unlikely event someone was inside, I decided I better knock on the door. And then I waited for an answer. Through the howling wind, I could have sworn I heard someone say, "Come in." As I swung open the door and stepped inside, a small avalanche of snow tumbled on in with me. I didn't even bother trying to kick it out as I fought against the wind so hard to close that door behind me. And the relief of being inside was instantaneous. Without that air whipping at me, I was able to put a stop to the timer that was ticking down to my freezing death. "Thanks," I whispered. I turned towards the inside of the cabin and tried to get my bearings, but all I saw was blackness, which meant I had no real way of gauging the size of the cabin. Yeah, I had circled around it when I was out in that blizzard, but I'd been stumbling around half blind in a whiteout, focused on trying to just find a doorknob. So I had no idea what length of the cabin I covered. I mean, I could have walked around half of it. I could have circled around it 3 times without realizing it. Through the darkness, all I could see was the vague outline of someone sitting in the corner. "You know, you're a real lifesaver," I said. He didn't answer. I pawed around for a lighter, a lantern, a matchbook, anything that might emit light. But all my fingertips touched were chains and the barrels of hunting rifles. I stopped poking around when I felt an open bear trap. I wouldn't want to get my arm caught in one of those, so it was much safer for me to just sit still and wait for daybreak. It occurred to me that stranger might have been seeking refuge as well. So I started to keep my tone light and innocent. "You the owner of this cabin?" I said. The answer was more of a hiss than a word, but in that hiss I heard a faint yes. I sat on the floor, let my hairs down beside me, and reached into my pack. Why I had taken a sleeping bag with me and not a flashlight was beyond me. I removed my wet clothes and quietly slipped into my sleeping bag to warm up, making conversation as I did. Hey, thanks again. That blizzard really came out of nowhere. He replied with the slow, labored, wheezy breaths of an elderly man on his deathbed. Dangerous, he said. Yeah, I chuckled. That's an understatement. Hungry, he exhaled. You got a fireplace? I've got a couple hares, I'll cook them up. It's the least I can do, I offered. His reply was drawn out like a wolf howling, but without the majestic hum. No, he said. Okay, as soon as the blizzard dies down, I'll go gather wood and make us a fire. Can you wait until then? I saw his silhouette shift slightly, and then there was a rattle of chains. No, again the O stretched out in a long, bloated groan. No, yes. The final no morphed strangely into a yes, like someone drastically changing to a much higher note on a flute halfway through a breath. I craned my neck to look at the single window in the cabin. It was pitch black, pitch white. It was like an afterglow visible against the black backdrop of the wood, yet still inherently dark. I focused on it rather than the rest of the cabin because it was the only hint of light that I could actually see. If you don't mind, I'm going to try and catch some shut-eye, I said tiredly. He didn't respond, but that didn't surprise me. Mountain folk don't talk much, even when they come down to town for what few supplies they can't make for themselves. I shrugged it off and settled in for the night, but I felt something hard against my side. Sighing, I tossed my hairs back a bit farther and got comfortable. I was exhausted, so it wasn't all that hard for me to drift off, despite the howling wind song playing outside the walls. I hugged myself in my sleeping bag and I drifted off. I was awoken by a different sound, a weird snapping crunch that made me shoot up in bed, believing that the ceiling was about to collapse under the weight of the snow. I braced myself, but as the sound came again, I realized it wasn't above me, but rather next to me, near my belongings. The silhouette was gone from the corner, and I could hear his deep, raspy breaths accompanying the crunch. What the hell are you doing? I snapped. He retreated back to his corner with a rattling of chains. My adrenaline was pumping, and I wasn't even sure why. Something about that stranger put me in a state of near panic. My instincts were telling me to leave, but I couldn't afford it. Whatever this guy was up to, I was safer with him than I was out there in that blizzard. I grabbed my backpack and popped myself up against the wall in a seated position, staring at the silhouette, expecting him to make a move. I kept myself awake and alert, never looking away, even as the howling wind slowly started to diminish in strength. Once or twice, I felt my head begin to dip and my eyes begin to shut. But every time I slipped, the faint rattle of chains snapped me right back into consciousness. As the blizzard began to clear and the sun slowly rose, light began to trickle into the cabin. The scene filtered through in tiny increments, with each layer uncovered by the sun, like a printer slowly spitting out the full picture, one line at a time. I wasn't in a cabin. I was in a large supply shed that was about maybe 10 to 11 feet long, 7 to 8 feet wide. There was no fireplace, which now makes sense for a supply shed. There were tools, traps, and rifles lining every wall. The silhouette in the corner slowly stopped becoming a silhouette and started being a distinct person. I mean, a skinny, pale, ghost white man. I was gutted. He was dead. Not, oh shoot, I died overnight. No. He was long dead. I mean, long dead. His body was all shriveled and mummified. Is that even the right word for it? He wasn't wrapped up in bandages or anything like that, but his skin was completely dehydrated and stiff, like an unwrapped mummy. His hair was hanging from his head in unkept strings. His teeth, they were poking out of his shrunken lips with a wide gap where the top right tooth should have been. There was a stain of aged old blood soaked into the wood beneath him. I followed it by gaze to its origin. His left foot and the bear trap in which it had gotten caught. There was an empty hook on the wall above him with a chain leading to the trap. It was long enough for him to move around, but not enough for him to reach the front door or to reach the saw which was hanging above it. My best guess was that trap had fallen on its own while he was outside, and at some point he'd done a supply run in the dark and had gotten caught in his very own trap. He'd probably died of thirst or something, Look, I'm telling you, he wasn't breathing. He wasn't moving. He was dead. Dead as a doornail, and had been for quite some time. I sat there reasoning. I'd been delirious. I'd been delirious the night before. The fatigue, the dehydration, the disorientation caused by that whiteout and the blizzard. It made me imagine his voice. Those slow hissing sounds I thought were replies. Those were just the wind. It was the wind outside. I'd interpret them wrong because the loneliness had finally gotten to me. The elements had conspired against me to create a living person out of someone who definitely wasn't alive. It was a good logical explanation, and I wish I could say it was true. Except I'm not the one who bit the head off of breakfast. It's not my canine tooth. That I found on the floor next to me. My dry, dirty wood like fingernails aren't the ones sticking out of the outside of my sleeping bag. I'm not the one who caked the corpse dry, cracking lips with white fur. And I definitely wasn't going to be the one to stick around for dinner. I always felt very safe in the forest. And when I moved to the city, I discovered a lovely riverside wilderness, an area where I could just walk off my stress. The winding track was just big enough for one person and long enough to walk for an hour. One of the best things was that it was rather unknown. So most weekends I had the wilderness all to myself. In Australia, the forest is very safe, as there are no bears, no wolves, and the dingoes are easy for an adult to handle. It's pure heaven. One sunny day, I happily strolled along, stopping every now and then to listen to a wombat scurrying away through the dense undergrowth. But it was when I reached the furthest point from the car park that I realized I was not alone. Those scurrying noises that I heard had suddenly stopped when I stopped. Again and again, this carried on until they were getting louder with each step I took. At first, I hoped I was imagining it, but then I had to face the fact that someone was actually sneaking behind me while hiding behind the undergrowth. At this point, my heart was thumping. At one point, I was trying to act very casual, and so I bent down to fake tie my shoelace, just trying to appear like I was not afraid. As I was doing the fake tie, I was also able to see what was going on behind me, but I could see nothing. Nothing but dense bushland at first, until suddenly my eyes caught hold of something on the ground. What I saw was two large men's work boots, which were standing half concealed behind a shrub. In my horror and shock, I was really hoping that they were empty. But as I examined carefully what I was actually viewing, I was then able to clearly see that these large boots were not just sitting there alone. No, these boots had big muscular legs inside of them. Now I knew for sure that the sounds I was hearing were coming from a large, broad man who was sneaking up behind me as I walked. Now, I'm a small woman, so a fight was definitely out of the question. I quickly stood up and then continued walking. My muscles were rigid with panic as I tried desperately to work out an escape plan. If I ran, I knew that I would quickly reach a dead end, and I would be doomed, as the man would stand between me and my path to safety. As my terror worsened, it also suddenly developed into an angry mass of adrenaline. I vowed to myself that I was not going to go down